If the flesh was still alive, the struggle would be simpler. You could point to it, blame it, fight it, discipline it, starve it, train it. You could treat your spiritual life like a battlefield where two equal forces wrestle for control. But that is not the reality you are living in anymore. The truth that few are willing to face is this: the flesh is not your enemy now. It has already been judged. It has already been crucified. It has already lost its authority. And yet something continues to sabotage your spiritual walk, not through force, but through delay, not through rebellion, but through hesitation, not through sin in its raw form, but through something far more subtle and far more dangerous: partial obedience. Many believers stay exhausted because they are fighting a war that ended at the cross. They keep trying to kill something that was already declared dead, while ignoring the one thing that still has power to either unlock freedom or block it completely. Obedience. Not loud obedience, not dramatic obedience, not the kind that makes noise in public spaces or earns approval, but the quiet, internal, daily obedience that requires you to move when God speaks, even when nothing inside you feels ready. This is uncomfortable because it removes your favorite excuse. You can no longer say, "I would obey, but my flesh is too strong." That statement feels humble, but it is not true. What you are really saying is, "I hear God, but I'm not willing to move yet." And that is a very different confession, one that shifts responsibility back where it belongs. The problem is not that the flesh keeps winning. The problem is that you keep negotiating with instructions that were never meant to be discussed. Grace did not come to excuse delay. Truth did not come to invite debate. Freedom did not come so you could circle the same mountain with better vocabulary. The flesh is already dead. What remains is whether you will walk in what has already been given or remain paralyzed by a false sense of spiritual struggle. This message is not gentle, but it is honest, and honesty is often the doorway to real peace. Because once you stop blaming the flesh, you are finally free to confront the real issue. Your obedience is no longer blocked by weakness, but by choice, and choice is where transformation either begins or quietly dies. The flesh is not your problem anymore, and that truth changes everything. One of the most misunderstood ideas in modern spirituality is the ongoing war with the flesh. It is preached constantly, talked about endlessly, and used as the explanation for nearly every failure, relapse, or delay in spiritual growth. The narrative is familiar. The flesh is powerful, relentless, always pulling you back, always resisting God. And while that narrative feels true emotionally, it collapses the moment you look at it through the lens of what actually happened at the cross. If the flesh was still alive in the way many describe it, then the cross failed to finish its work. But the cross did not come to weaken the flesh. It came to execute it, not symbolically, not gradually, not conditionally. The language used is final: dead, crucified, put to death. And dead things do not resist. They do not argue. They do not negotiate. They do not overpower. They only appear powerful when someone keeps resurrecting them in their mind. This is where most people get trapped. They confuse memory with power, habit with authority, sensation with command. Just because something feels familiar does not mean it has permission. Just because a desire appears does not mean it rules. The flesh survives only as a story you continue to tell yourself, not as a ruler that still governs you. Here is the uncomfortable truth. What you often call the flesh acting up is actually you pausing at the edge of obedience and choosing comfort over movement. The flesh does not stop you from obeying. It suggests, it whispers, it reminds you of old pathways, but it cannot command. Only you can decide whether to act. This is why many people feel stuck even after years of spiritual knowledge. They know the language. They know the scriptures. They know the warnings. They know the promises. But knowledge without movement creates a unique form of paralysis. You begin to live in a state where you are always almost ready, always just one insight away, always waiting for a feeling that never comes. And while you wait, life passes, opportunities close, and obedience slowly becomes theoretical instead of lived. The flesh benefits from this misunderstanding, not because it is strong, but because it is convenient to blame. If the flesh is the villain, you remain the victim, and victims do not have to act. Victims wait, victims explain, victims justify. But the moment you accept that the flesh no longer holds authority, you are no longer a victim. You are responsible. And responsibility is terrifying because it removes all excuses. This is why true freedom feels heavier at first. It comes with weight, with ownership, with the realization that God is not waiting for you to feel strong enough. He is waiting for you to trust that what He said is already true. Obedience is not the reward of victory. It is the expression of believing that victory already happened. When you delay obedience, you are not being cautious. You are being selective. You are deciding which instructions feel reasonable, which ones feel safe, which ones fit your emotional readiness. And the moment obedience becomes conditional, it stops being obedience at all. It becomes negotiation, and negotiation always assumes equality of authority. That is the real danger. The flesh is not keeping you from moving forward. Your hesitation is, your overthinking is, your need to feel prepared is, your attachment to understanding everything before acting is. These are not signs of humility, they are signs of control, and control is the last thing most people are willing to surrender, even to God. This is why transformation often begins with something small but uncomfortable. A conversation you keep postponing, a habit you keep explaining, a step you keep spiritualizing instead of taking. The flesh does not need to overpower you when delay does the job just fine. Once you accept that the flesh is already dead, something shifts internally. You stop asking, "Why is this so hard?" and start asking, "Why am I hesitating?" That question is far more revealing because the answer is rarely weakness. It is usually fear. Fear of loss, fear of discomfort, fear of change, fear of who you might become if you actually obey without conditions. Obedience is not about proving devotion. It is about alignment, and alignment does not wait for emotions to agree. It moves because truth has already been spoken. When you delay obedience, you are not protecting yourself. You are keeping yourself in a loop that feels spiritual but produces no fruit. The flesh is already dead. It cannot stop you. It cannot dominate you. It cannot rule you. What remains is whether you will step into what is already finished or continue fighting a shadow while avoiding the one decision that would actually change everything. Obedience is not delayed because you are weak, but because you are still attached. Most people assume that obedience fails because they are not strong enough. They imagine obedience as the final stage of spiritual maturity, something that comes after discipline, clarity, healing, and confidence. But that assumption is precisely what keeps obedience out of reach. Obedience is not the reward for becoming strong. It is the act that exposes what you are still attached to. Attachment is quieter than rebellion. It does not shout. It does not openly resist God. In fact, attachment often disguises itself as wisdom, patience, discernment, or even humility. You tell yourself you are waiting for the right timing, the right feeling, the right confirmation. But beneath that language, there is usually something much simpler and much harder to admit. You do not want to let go yet. Attachment is not always about sin in the obvious sense. Sometimes it is attachment to familiarity. Sometimes it is attachment to identity. Sometimes it is attachment to how things used to work, even if they no longer give life. You cling not because it is evil, but because it is known. And the human mind prefers the familiar pain over the unfamiliar freedom. This is why obedience feels threatening, not because it demands moral perfection, but because it demands release. Obedience always asks for something before it explains what comes next. It asks you to move before you see, to leave before you understand, to trust before you feel safe. And attachment resists that, because attachment wants guarantees. The uncomfortable truth is that many delays labeled as spiritual struggle are actually emotional negotiations. You are not wrestling with temptation as much as you are bargaining with loss. Loss of control, loss of comfort, loss of narrative, loss of who you thought you were allowed to be. Obedience does not only remove behaviors, it dismantles identities that were built without permission. This is why people who are deeply spiritual can remain deeply stuck. They have mastered insight, but not surrender. They can articulate truth beautifully, but they have not allowed it to rearrange their life. Knowledge becomes a shield that protects attachment instead of exposing it. And the more articulate you become, the easier it is to justify standing still. Attachment feeds on delay. The longer you postpone obedience, the more reasonable attachment begins to feel. You start building theology around it, psychology around it, circumstances around it. Eventually, what started as hesitation turns into a lifestyle that feels spiritually responsible but produces no movement. And stagnation, when spiritualized, is one of the hardest states to escape. Obedience breaks attachment not by force, but by motion. The moment you move, attachment loses its grip because attachment relies on imagination. It thrives on what if. What if I lose this? What if it doesn't work? What if I regret it? But obedience does not live in what if, it lives in what is. It is an act that collapses hypothetical fears into lived reality, and most fears do not survive contact with movement. This is why obedience is often small, specific, and unimpressive at first. It rarely announces itself as a dramatic life overhaul. It shows up as a phone call you avoid, a habit you stop excusing, a boundary you finally enforce, a truth you stop softening. These moments do not feel heroic, but they are surgical. They cut attachment at its root. The reason obedience feels heavy is not because God is demanding, but because attachment has weight. You have been carrying things that were never meant to travel with you into the next phase. And when God calls you forward, He does not negotiate cargo. He simply invites movement. What falls off reveals what never belonged. Many people mistake emotional discomfort for divine resistance. They assume that if obedience produces anxiety, confusion, or grief, then it must be premature. But obedience often hurts precisely because it is correct. Detachment feels like death because it is the death of false security. And death, even when necessary, is never comfortable. This is where faith is misunderstood. Faith is not emotional certainty. It is trust expressed through action, despite emotional noise. Obedience is faith made visible. And attachment hates visibility because it cannot hide once movement begins. You see clearly what you were holding on to the moment you release it. Another hidden layer of attachment is attachment to outcomes. You are willing to obey if you can predict the result. If obedience guarantees peace, success, clarity, or validation, you are ready. But if obedience means stepping into ambiguity, silence, or obscurity, you hesitate. This reveals that what you want is not alignment, but assurance. And assurance is not promised, only presence is. Obedience does not promise comfort, it promises direction. And direction without comfort tests whether you trust the voice or only the benefits. This is why obedience matures people faster than insight ever will. Insight informs the mind. Obedience reshapes the will, and the will is where attachment lives. When you delay obedience, you are not preserving peace, you are prolonging tension. The internal friction you feel is not God pressuring you, it is the strain of holding on to something while being called to move forward. That tension only resolves when one of two things happens. Either you let go or you stop listening. And most people choose the second without realizing it. They numb the voice. They distract themselves. They fill the silence with content, conversation, activity. Not because they are rebellious, but because silence keeps asking the same question: when will you move? And eventually, ignoring that question feels easier than answering it. But unresolved obedience does not disappear. It hardens. It turns into restlessness, dissatisfaction, vague anxiety, or spiritual fatigue. You feel tired even when nothing has happened, drained even when you have not moved, because the energy required to suppress obedience is greater than the energy required to follow it. This is why obedience often brings relief, even when it brings difficulty. The relief is not circumstantial, it is internal. Something aligns, something stops pulling in opposite directions, something settles. Not because everything is solved, but because you are no longer divided. Attachment divides you. One part wants God, another part wants safety on its own terms. Obedience reunifies you. It brings your actions back into agreement with what you already believe. And integrity, even when costly, is lighter than division. The flesh is not resisting you here. Attachment is. And attachment is not defeated by discipline alone. It is defeated by decision, a moment where you stop asking how you will feel and start asking whether you will move. That moment is rarely dramatic. Often it is quiet, but it is decisive. You do not need more strength to obey. You need less attachment. And detachment does not come from waiting. It comes from acting, from stepping forward with trembling hands and discovering that the ground does not collapse beneath you, that the voice that called you was steady all along, that what you feared losing was already limiting you. Obedience does not strip you, it frees you, but freedom requires release. And release always feels like loss until you realize what you gained was movement, alignment, and peace that no attachment could ever provide. Partial obedience feels safe, but it is the most effective form of resistance. One of the most dangerous illusions in spiritual life is the belief that partial obedience is still obedience. It feels reasonable. It feels balanced. It feels mature. You are not outright refusing God. You are simply adjusting the pace, refining the details, waiting for better alignment. On the surface, it looks cooperative, but underneath, partial obedience functions as a sophisticated form of resistance because it allows you to appear faithful while remaining in control. Partial obedience is attractive because it reduces risk. You obey the parts that cost you little, while postponing the parts that threaten comfort, identity, or stability. You move where obedience overlaps with your preferences, and you slow down where it challenges them. This creates the illusion of progress without the vulnerability of surrender, and that illusion can last for years. The problem is not that partial obedience is weak. The problem is that it trains you to trust yourself more than the voice that called you. Every time you modify an instruction to make it more palatable, you reinforce the idea that you are the final authority over timing, scope, and outcome. Over time, this reshapes your inner posture. You stop listening to obey, you listen to evaluate. This is where many people quietly stall. They continue to hear God, but only as a consultant, someone whose input is considered, weighed, and then revised. Obedience becomes collaborative instead of responsive, and collaboration with God sounds spiritual until you realize that collaboration assumes equality of authority. Partial obedience often hides behind language like wisdom and discernment. You tell yourself you are being careful, thoughtful, strategic, and sometimes discernment truly is needed. But discernment does not contradict clarity. When an instruction is clear, continued analysis is not discernment. It is delay. Delay feels harmless because nothing dramatic happens when you choose it. There is no immediate consequence, no visible collapse, no loud warning. Life simply continues. But that is precisely why it is so effective. Delay erodes momentum quietly. It dulls urgency. It normalizes disobedience without ever calling it that. Over time, partial obedience changes how you relate to conviction. Conviction no longer prompts action. It prompts reflection. You feel it, acknowledge it, even agree with it, and then return to your routine unchanged. This creates a subtle internal fracture. You believe one thing, but you live another, and that gap is where peace slowly leaks out. This is why many people feel spiritually tired without being actively sinful. They are not rebelling, they are compartmentalizing. And compartmentalization requires constant effort. You have to keep truth contained so it does not interfere with your comfort. You have to silence certain promptings while amplifying others. That inner management is exhausting. Partial obedience also distorts your perception of God. When you delay action, you begin projecting your hesitation onto Him. You assume He is waiting, ambiguous, undecided. But often the silence you interpret as divine patience is simply the absence of movement on your part. God is not withholding clarity, He is waiting for response. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. Clarity often follows obedience, not the other way around. We prefer the opposite. We want full understanding before commitment, but obedience is not a contract, it is trust. And trust moves without seeing the entire path. Partial obedience demands visibility before vulnerability. Full obedience chooses vulnerability before visibility. That difference determines whether transformation remains theoretical or becomes lived. Another danger of partial obedience is that it preserves old patterns while adopting new language. You talk about growth, healing, purpose, and calling, but your daily decisions remain unchanged. The words evolve, but the movement does not. This creates spiritual inflation. You sound advanced, but your life stays static. This is especially common among people who consume a lot of spiritual content. Insight becomes a substitute for obedience. You feel nourished because you are informed, but information does not metabolize into change unless acted upon. The more insight you collect without movement, the harder it becomes to move, because now obedience threatens not only comfort, but identity. You see yourself as someone who understands, and understanding without obedience feels safer than ignorance with surrender. Partial obedience also delays healing. Many wounds remain open not because God refuses to heal, but because healing requires an action you keep postponing. A boundary, a confession, a release, a step away. Healing is often blocked not by pain, but by the fear of what healing will cost. Obedience would force you to rearrange relationships, routines, or self-image. And partial obedience allows you to ask for healing without change. This is where frustration grows. You pray sincerely, you believe genuinely, you wait expectantly, and yet nothing shifts. The issue is not faith, it is follow-through. You are asking God to override a structure you are still actively maintaining. Partial obedience maintains access points to old cycles. You leave doors cracked open. You tell yourself it is harmless, temporary, controlled. But what you keep accessible continues to influence you. Obedience that is incomplete leaves room for relapse, not because you are weak, but because you never fully exited the old environment. Full obedience feels extreme because it removes options, it closes doors without keeping backups. And that is precisely why it works. Transformation requires exclusivity. You cannot walk in two directions at once. Partial obedience tries to compromise direction. Full obedience commits to one. There is also a grief that comes with full obedience that partial obedience allows you to avoid. Grief over what you leave behind, over who you thought you would be, over relationships that cannot follow you forward. Partial obedience postpones that grief, But it does not eliminate it. It simply stretches it over time, turning sharp pain into chronic ache. When you obey fully, grief comes quickly but cleanly. When you obey partially, grief lingers indefinitely. And lingering grief often disguises itself as confusion, dissatisfaction, or spiritual dryness. The reason partial obedience feels safer is because it preserves control. You still decide how far, how fast, and how much, but control is incompatible with trust. And trust is the foundation of any real relationship with God. Without trust, obedience becomes mechanical or selective. With trust, obedience becomes relational. God does not need your partial yes. He responds to surrender, not negotiation. And surrender does not mean understanding everything. It means releasing your demand to understand before moving. The hardest step in obedience is rarely the external action. It is the internal decision to stop revising the instruction, to stop softening it, to stop delaying it under spiritual language. That decision feels like standing at the edge of something irreversible, and in a sense it is. You cannot fully obey and remain the same. Partial obedience allows you to feel spiritual without becoming vulnerable. Full obedience requires vulnerability without guarantees. That is why one produces stagnation and the other produces transformation. If you feel like you have been circling the same lessons, the same themes, the same internal conversations, it is worth asking an uncomfortable question. What instruction have I been partially obeying? What step have I reframed, delayed, or diluted to make it manageable? Because the area where you feel stuck is often the area where obedience has been incomplete. The flesh is not keeping you here. Fear is not overpowering you. You are standing still because partial obedience has convinced you that movement can wait. But growth does not happen in delay. It happens in decision. Why obedience feels harder than sin, even after you accept the truth. One of the most confusing experiences for many people is realizing that obedience can feel heavier than sin. Not because sin is easy, but because sin is familiar. It follows known patterns. It keeps you inside structures you already understand. Obedience, on the other hand, disrupts those structures. It forces you to live differently, not just believe differently. And living differently requires sustained alignment, not momentary conviction. Sin often offers immediate relief. It numbs, distracts, comforts, or affirms. Even when it damages you, it does so in ways that feel predictable. You know what comes next. Obedience offers no such predictability. It removes crutches without immediately replacing them. It demands action without guaranteeing emotional payoff. And that uncertainty is what the mind resists most. The mind is designed to protect continuity. It values patterns over truth when patterns feel safer. This is why you can intellectually accept truth while emotionally resisting its application. Acceptance does not threaten the mind. Alignment does. Alignment requires rewiring habits, schedules, relationships, and self-perception. It requires you to live as if what you believe is actually real. This is where many people misinterpret their resistance. They assume that if obedience feels difficult, something must be wrong. They interpret internal friction as a sign to slow down. But friction is not always resistance from God. Often it is resistance from your internal system adjusting to a new authority. You have lived for years under certain internal rules. Rules about how you cope, how you avoid pain, how you manage fear, how you secure approval. Obedience challenges those rules. It introduces a new center of decision-making. And any system resists when its operating logic changes. This is why obedience feels like loss before it feels like freedom. You lose old reflexes, old shortcuts, old identities that helped you survive. Even if those identities were unhealthy, They were functional. Obedience does not honor survival strategies, it replaces them, and replacement always triggers fear. Sin rarely threatens identity in the same way. It allows you to remain who you are while soothing discomfort. Obedience asks you to become someone else, someone less reactive, less controlled by impulse, less dependent on external validation. That transformation is deeply unsettling because it removes the version of you that knew how to navigate the world on its own terms. This is why the mind often reframes obedience as extreme, too rigid, too costly, too disruptive. It exaggerates the sacrifice while minimizing the benefit, not because the benefit is small, but because it is unknown. The mind prefers known pain to unknown freedom. Another reason obedience feels heavier than sin is that obedience is continuous. Sin is often episodic. It happens, it ends, it resets. Obedience requires consistency. It asks you to keep choosing alignment when no one is watching, when nothing dramatic is happening, when motivation fluctuates. That sustained attention feels demanding because it requires presence. Presence is uncomfortable when you are used to distraction. Obedience removes escape routes. You can no longer blame circumstances, emotions, or people for your state. You must show up internally, and showing up internally exposes unresolved fears, grief, and insecurity that distraction kept buried. This is why obedience often surfaces emotional turbulence that feels unrelated to the instruction itself. You obey in one area, and suddenly anxiety appears elsewhere. Not because obedience caused the anxiety, but because obedience removed the numbing behaviors that were masking it. Healing is rarely linear. Alignment stirs what has been dormant. Many people interpret this turbulence as failure. They assume obedience should produce immediate peace, but peace is not the absence of disturbance. It is the presence of order, and order takes time to establish when chaos has been normalized. Obedience also feels harder than sin because obedience removes negotiation. Sin thrives in ambiguity. It lives in gray areas, in exceptions, in justifications. Obedience is clear. It simplifies choices. And simplicity is threatening when you are accustomed to complexity as a form of control. Complexity allows you to delay, to weigh options endlessly, to remain undecided while feeling responsible. Obedience collapses complexity into action, and action exposes you. You can no longer hide behind intention. You are defined by movement actions. This exposure is uncomfortable because it reveals where your trust truly lies, not in what you say, but in what you do when obedience costs you something. That revelation can feel confrontational, even humiliating, but it is also clarifying. It removes illusion. Another hidden reason obedience feels harder than sin is that obedience requires you to endure the gap between instruction and outcome. You act, and then you wait. That waiting is where most people break alignment, because waiting without reassurance forces you to rely on trust rather than feedback. Sin gives feedback immediately. Obedience often delays it. And delayed feedback triggers doubt. You start questioning whether you heard correctly, whether it was worth it, whether you moved too soon. This is where many people retreat into partial obedience again, not because they changed their mind, but because uncertainty feels unbearable. But uncertainty is not abandonment, it is space. Space for trust to deepen, space for dependence to shift, space for identity to realign. If God filled every obedient step with instant validation, obedience would become transactional. You would obey for results, not for relationship. Obedience trains you to trust the voice more than the outcome. And that training is uncomfortable because it dismantles performance-based spirituality. You are no longer obeying to earn peace. You obey because alignment is right, even when peace lags behind. This is why obedience matures people faster than success ever will. Success reinforces methods. Obedience reshapes motives. And reshaping motives requires confrontation with self. The mind resists this because it prefers control over transformation. Control allows you to predict. Transformation requires surrender. And surrender feels like vulnerability. You are no longer self-sufficient. You are no longer managing your image. You are dependent. Dependency is not weakness, it is alignment. But it feels like weakness to a mind trained to survive independently. This is why obedience often feels lonely. You cannot always explain it. You cannot always defend it logically. You cannot always bring others with you. You move because you were called, not because it was popular or understood. That solitude tests whether your obedience is rooted in approval or conviction. Sin often comes with company. Obedience often comes with isolation, not because God isolates you, but because alignment separates you from patterns that others still rely on. And separation feels like loss until new connections form. Obedience is harder than sin because obedience dismantles the self that sin preserved. Sin keeps you functional without forcing you to change at your core. Obedience reaches the core and rearranges it. But this is also why obedience heals more deeply than sin ever could. It does not just remove behaviors, it restructures the internal world that produced them. It does not just correct actions, it restores alignment. The discomfort of obedience is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is often evidence that something fundamental is shifting. You are no longer governed by impulse, attachment, or fear. You are learning to move from trust. And trust, when practiced consistently, becomes lighter over time. Not because the cost disappears, but because alignment reduces internal conflict. You are no longer pulled in opposite directions. The energy once spent resisting is now available for living. When obedience feels heavier than sin, it is not because obedience is cruel. It is because obedience is honest. It asks you to live what you believe, not just agree with it. Obedience restores peace by reordering authority within you. Peace does not return to your life when circumstances finally cooperate. It returns when authority is correctly placed inside you. This is one of the most overlooked truths about obedience. People expect obedience to fix situations, relationships, emotions, or outcomes, but obedience's primary work is internal. It reorganizes who is in charge. As long as your emotions hold authority, obedience will feel unstable. As long as your fears have veto power, obedience will feel conditional. As long as your preferences dictate timing, obedience will feel exhausting. Peace cannot exist in a divided structure. It requires hierarchy. Something must lead and something must follow. When obedience is delayed, it is usually because authority is misplaced. Feelings decide, logic negotiates, comfort moderates. God's instruction becomes one voice among many instead of the final word. This creates internal noise. You hear too much and act too little, and that noise slowly erodes peace. Obedience simplifies the internal system. It does not remove emotions or thoughts. It puts them in their proper place. Feelings are acknowledged, not obeyed. Thoughts are considered, not followed blindly. Fear is recognized, not crowned. Authority shifts upward, and peace follows order. This is why peace often arrives after obedience, not before it. You are not waiting for peace to obey. You obey so peace can return. Peace is not a motivator. It is a byproduct of alignment. When authority is disordered, even good desires become burdens. You want to do the right thing, but you feel overwhelmed. You believe truth, but you feel restless. You pray, but you feel fragmented. That fragmentation is not spiritual failure. It is structural confusion. Too many voices are making decisions. Obedience quiets the noise by choosing one voice to follow, not because the other voices disappear, but because they are no longer in charge. That decision alone reduces internal tension dramatically. This is why obedience often feels like relief, even when nothing external changes. The relief comes from coherence. You are no longer arguing with yourself. You're no longer justifying delay. You're no longer split between knowing and doing. Integrity returns, and integrity is lighter than compromise. Compromise feels reasonable, but it is heavy. It requires constant management. You must remember why you delayed, how you explained it, what you told yourself. Obedience requires memory only once. You decided, you moved. The matter is settled. This internal settlement is what many people mistake for spiritual numbness. In reality, it is peace. Peace is not emotional excitement. It is the absence of internal conflict. It is the feeling of standing in one place instead of being pulled in three directions. Obedience also restores trust. Not just trust in God, but trust in yourself. When you obey, you prove to yourself that you can act in alignment with truth even when it costs you. That builds internal confidence, not arrogance, but stability. You become someone who follows through. This stability is crucial because many people do not trust themselves anymore. They have delayed too often, negotiated too long, promised movement without delivering it. Obedience repairs that fracture. It rebuilds self-respect. Peace cannot exist where self-respect is absent. You may feel calm temporarily, but deep peace requires knowing that your actions match your convictions. Obedience restores that congruence. Another way obedience restores peace is by ending internal bargaining. Bargaining keeps you mentally busy. You replay conversations, you imagine scenarios, you rehearse justifications. All of that consumes energy. Obedience ends the negotiation. You stop revisiting the same decision repeatedly. Mental space opens. This is why obedience often feels like clarity, even when life remains complex. You are not less aware, you are less divided. That division was the real weight. Obedience also recalibrates desire. When authority shifts, desires begin to align. What once felt irresistible loses intensity, not because you fought it, but because it no longer rules. Authority starves old impulses more effectively than discipline ever could. This is why the flesh feels powerless after consistent obedience, not because desires disappear, but because they are no longer obeyed. Power shifts. Habits follow authority. Peace deepens as this pattern stabilizes. You stop bracing for failure. You stop fearing relapse constantly. You trust the structure you have built. And that trust reduces anxiety. Obedience does not eliminate struggle, it eliminates chaos. Struggle within order is manageable. Chaos within desire is not. Peace lives in order, not in ease. This is why obedience is not about perfection. It is about direction. You may stumble, but you are moving forward. You may feel resistance, but you are aligned. That alignment sustains peace even in difficulty. The flesh being dead means it no longer holds authority. But authority must still be exercised. Obedience is how you exercise it. Not aggressively, not fearfully, but decisively. When you obey, you are not proving holiness. You are acknowledging order. You are saying, "This voice leads, and the rest follow." And once that order is established, peace has room to breathe. Peace is not something you chase. It is something that returns when the house is put in order. Obedience does not decorate the house. It rearranges it. And once the furniture stops blocking the doorway, peace walks in quietly and stays. This is the final truth many resist. Obedience does not restrict you. It stabilizes you. It does not shrink your life. It clarifies it. And clarity is the soil where peace grows. The flesh is already dead. The battle is not about power. It is about authority. And authority is exercised through obedience, not emotion, not insight, not intention. When authority is restored, peace follows. Not dramatically, not loudly, but deeply. And deeply is where it lasts.